This video is meant to be a supplement to my other video where I explained the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO and how they all interrelated. A lot of you were asking for a more visual demonstration, so I broke out the teddy bear here, and we're going to show the difference of when the aperture changes and the necessity for changing the shutter speed to maintain the same exposure. And then we're also going to show a brief demonstration of the ISO and its relationship to shutter speed. But first we're going to start with aperture. So what we've got here on this first slide is a very low aperture. This is f1.4, and we are at 1/320th of a second to get this exposure on the bear, which is a proper exposure. It's not underexposed and it's not overexposed. You can see the f1.4 is a very shallow depth of field. The background is completely out of focus and the bear is in focus. Now in this next slide, we went to f2.0, which is the next full stop in the aperture spectrum. And in order to keep the same exposure on the bear, we had to cut the shutter speed in half. Now the reason for this is every time that you increase your aperture by one full stop, you're actually dividing in half the amount of light that is let in when the shutter goes off. So in order to compensate for half the amount of light coming in, we have to double the shutter speed, the length of time that the light is actually let in. So if you increase the aperture by a full stop and half the amount of light that comes in, you double the shutter speed, and in effect the same amount of light comes in, which is exactly what you can see here. We're the same exposure. Now the next full stop is f2.8, this next slide. You can see that as the aperture increases, the background is starting to become into focus. It's still fairly out of focus, but it's in greater focus than was on f1.4 or f2.0. Now again, because we went up one full stop on the f-stop range, we had to cut the shutter speed in half from 160th of a second down to an 80th of a second. Now this next slide, from 2.8 we went to f4.0, and again we cut the shutter speed down to a 40th of a second from an 80th of a second. So again, we're letting in half as much light, so we are needing to keep the shutter open twice as long to maintain the same exposure on the bear. Next slide, f5.6. Again, you can see the background coming into focus a little bit more. We went from a 40th of a second to a 20th of a second, and again maintain the same exposure. Now here we are at f8.0, from a 20th of a second to a 10th of a second. Again, that background is now coming into more, I wouldn't say exactly crisp focus, but it's definitely in much more focus than in some of the earlier f-stops. Now at this next slide we're at f11, which would be considered a fairly high aperture. Now this means the lens of the camera is very narrow. It's not letting in much light at all. We are down to a 1/5 of a second. Went from a 1/10 of a second at f8 to a 1/5 of a second at f11. And finally here we are at f16, which is a very high aperture number. It's basically a pinhole letting in light, so we went from a 1/5 of a second down to a 1/3 of a second. So there you can see we started at a very low aperture, which would be also known as a wide aperture, f1.4. The depth of field was very shallow. We went all the way up through 8 different full stops up to f16, which is a very high or narrow aperture. And at f1.4 we were at 320th of a second. You can see that the background was extremely blurry. The depth of field was very shallow. And on the other end of the spectrum, f16, almost everything in the picture was in focus. And we had to go from a 320th of a second down to a 1/3 of a second. So in that last section, we were looking at the relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed, and as the aperture changed, how we had to adjust the shutter speed to create the same exposure on the bear. Now we're going to do something similar in this one. It's not going to be as dramatic because we're going to maintain the same aperture, f2.8, but what we're going to do is change the ISO. And if you remember from the first video, the ISO adjusts the sensitivity to light of your camera's image sensor. On the low end, we're going to start at ISO 100. So we are at f2.8 and ISO 100, and we are at 1/100th of a second. Now this next slide is basically the same exact photo. All we did was increase the ISO to 200 So we doubled it from 100 to 200, which made the sensor twice as sensitive to light. So in effect, every time the shutter goes off, it lets in twice as much light as it did at f100. So to compensate for that, we had to double the shutter speed from 100th of a second to 200th of a second so that it's not open as long. If we left it at 100th of a second, we would have exposed more light on the picture, on the image sensor, and it would have been overexposed. So next we went to ISO 400. To increase the ISO by a full stop, you have to double it. So from ISO 200, we went to 400. Again, we had to double the shutter speed from 200th of a second to 400th of a second. As you can see, the exposure is virtually identical. And here we are at ISO 800. From 400, we doubled it to 800. Again, we doubled the shutter speed from 400th of a second to 800th of a second. This next slide, this is ISO 1600, and we are at 1600ths of a second. So when the shutter is going off, it's actually only open to let in light 1/1600th of a second. And finally, here we are at ISO 3200, which is a very high ISO. On a lot of cameras at 3200, the picture is going to start to get quite grainy, and you're going to lose some quality, but the shutter is very sensitive to light, so now we are at 3200ths of a second. So again, from the first slide here at ISO 100 and 100th of a second, all the way up to the last slide at ISO 3200 and 3200ths of a second, you can see the exposure has virtually remained the same throughout all these slides. Now this becomes important, especially like shooting sports or when you're trying to capture a moving image. You need the shutter speed to be higher, in the neighborhood of 400 or 800th of a second or higher. As a result, you're having to adjust the ISO higher because you want to maintain your aperture at, say, f2.8 as we did here. So in order to get that higher shutter speed, you can't adjust the aperture to let in more light, so you're going to adjust the ISO. So I hope that was helpful to you, just some examples so you could visually see how we maintain the same exposure while changing these different elements, the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Hopefully you will be able to apply that to your photography as you run into the different situations. I encourage you to go out and practice, and best of luck to you.